Hello, and welcome to Let's Talk Transformation. I'm Susie Lewis, your host, and today we are talking about something you have all lived through, probably this week, maybe even this morning, effective meetings. So we're living through a collaboration paradox. Work has never been more complex, change has never been faster, and yet the main areas where we're supposed to figure it out together are still stuck in the industrial era. And by that, I mean the meeting. You know, that sacred, soul-destroying, unavoidable cornerstone of organizational life, which is sometimes fun, sometimes not, but they're back-to-back and they fill your calendar. So here's the thing, and this is what my guest today argues, and argues brilliantly. The problem isn't that meetings are inherently bad. The problem is that most meetings are designed for a top-down, factory-like world, where the point was to issue orders and keep hierarchy visible. That world is gone, but the meeting practices haven't. So it's what I like to call meeting legacy systems. My guest today is Rebecca Hinds. She holds a PhD from Stanford. Her research focused on how emerging technologies are reshaping the way we work. And she founded and led the Work Innovation Lab at Asana, and in 2025 launched the Work AI Institute at Glean, and has advised Fortune 500 companies on this very subject: meeting overload, hybrid dysfunction, AI adoption. And her book, Your Best Meeting Ever, hold that thought, makes one provocative claim: meetings are not actually a time problem, although that's how we perceive them. They are a design problem. So using 7 product design principles borrowed from tech, she talks about how to turn meetings into genuine engines of collaboration. So this episode sits at the intersection of organizational design, human psychology, product design, and the super practical question of how do we run meetings differently and more effectively? Rebecca, welcome to Let's Talk Transformation. I have been looking forward to this conversation.
As have I. Thank you so much for having me, Susie.
Rebecca, it's a pleasure. Your book, which is brilliant, by the way, opens with the World War II sabotage manual, Weapons of Mass Dysfunction, which encouraged ordinary citizens to derail enemy operations with endless, aimless meetings. It sounds familiar. So if I fast forward to today's workplace, this is still the case. And there are figures that show that poorly run meetings drain trillions of dollars a year. So let's start there. You've sat in a lot of meetings with a lot of organizations. What's the worst pattern you keep seeing, and the one that makes you think, oh my goodness, we haven't moved?
I mean, the worst pattern is the sheer volume of the dysfunctional meetings that exist in organizations. You go into an organization and always on the order of 30, 40, 50% of all meetings, people say if they eliminate them, they would have no real negative consequences. The problem fundamentally is we cling to these meetings out of legacy, out of habit, because they feel like the most reliable way to move work forward. That's the pattern. Now, the drivers are multifaceted in terms of why we keep these things on the calendar, but the fundamental problem is we do so by default. We do so because we think that meetings are the most reliable way to move things forward, when really they're the most expensive way to move things forward in so many ways, and should be used as a last resort, a very important last resort. Meetings are incredibly valuable, but because they're so expensive, we should default to those simpler, less expensive modes of collaboration and communication before we default to the meeting.
And I think, it's our comfort zone, isn't it? It's the comforting illusion of progress. Oh, we'll have a meeting about it and then we'll move forward. But as you say, we don't. We just sort of talk about it. And in each chapter in your book, you tackle a common meeting dysfunction. And I think, having worked with design thinking and in product operating models, I loved the idea of intentionally looking at meetings and looking through this product lens. So for people who are not from a product or tech background, can you explain that shift in thinking and what it brings to the world of meetings? Because, this meetingitis or reunionitis, or, everybody just, oh, I'm too busy. Oh, I'm so busy. And it does become a badge of honor, doesn't it? So the more meetings you have back to back, the more senior you are, the better leader you are, et cetera, et cetera. So I love the product lens. Can you walk us through that?
Sure. And I think what you just touched on in terms of, it's often referred to as visibility bias, I think is the fundamental problem here. The fact that we as humans, we associate presence with productivity, what's visible with what's valuable. And that's a big problem in so many organizations, because most of the real work is usually highly invisible, right? It's hard to see someone thinking through a problem, thinking strategically, coaching a teammate, rewriting that email. But meetings are highly visible, right? I think they're the most visible form of work we have, certainly the most visible form of communication. We can often see people's calendars within the organization. We can certainly see people in a conference room leaning into a Zoom screen. And because we associate visibility with value, meetings become a status symbol. And we all feel it. We look at someone's calendar, we see it overflowing. Our first response is, wow, this person must be busy. They must be important. They must have high status within the organization. And so I think that's at the root of so much of this. And so treating meetings like a product, meetings are the most important product in so many ways in our organizations. They're where the most important decisions get made, where alignment is often set, certainly where culture gets built or broken. And yet they're also often the least optimized product in our entire organization. And I've long been fascinated by the fact that we know meetings are dysfunctional. We spend so much time in them, and in organizations that track every dollar, every cent in their budgets, to not think critically about meetings and whether meetings are worth the investment is such a paradox in terms of what we know to be true about organizations. So the product design lens is intended to bring that level of intentionality. We would never ship a product to our customers without design, feedback, refinement, iteration. Our customers are the people in the meeting. Well, why don't we take that same level of rigor and discipline and intentionality to these very important and expensive work practices?
And I mean, we'll come back to culture change because it's something I want to touch on a little bit more, but who is the user of a meeting? So if I take your product lens and, you've got the user and we start with the empathy, what do they need? What do they feel? What's it about? Who should be there? How would you define the user of such a meeting? Because it's simple on a piece of paper, but like you say, the habits are so ingrained and we're hemorrhaging money on meetings that don't necessarily produce any type of decision. Some do, of course, otherwise we wouldn't have them. But I'm really
Mhm.
interested in how you would help people look at what is a user for my meeting.
There are two people who tend to leave meetings most satisfied. This is great research that my colleague Stephen Rogoberg has done. Others have done as well. Two people tend to leave meetings more satisfied than anyone else: the organizer and the person who has spoken the most in the meeting, right? Often we default to designing the meetings based on what we need as the organizer or what would help us move work forward. The users of our meeting are absolutely the attendees. And usually, if we're designing meetings exclusively or predominantly for us as the organizer, usually that's better served as information exchange. Usually it happens more effectively asynchronously, right? If we truly need a meeting, well, we truly should need synchronous communication. And in those cases, we should be designing for our customers, the users, who are the attendees. Often that's not the case. Often performatively it might be the case, but in terms of actual action, are we designing the agenda so that it's relevant for the attendees? Are we ensuring that every person has a key role to play? Their action is needed in the meeting. They're not just needing to consume the information, because again, we can, approach the meeting format differently in those cases. So often we don't take the time to really think about who is the customer, who is the user, and how do we structure the meeting so that it's worth the time that they invest and we treat their time more valuable than our own.
And I just want to stay on value for a moment, and then we'll move on to the idea of meeting debt, which I love, which is also borrowed from tech, like tech debt. But this whole idea of hemorrhaging money and just having meetings all the time, and people are so busy, they delegate to other people who don't necessarily have the decisional power. So you have to have another meeting, et cetera, et cetera. I think we can all identify with that. But if I come to one of your principles, I think it's the second one around measuring, measuring and metrics of meetings and return on time invested and the idea of impact and effort. Can you walk us through that? Because that for me, Rebecca, as I read it, my 20 years in organizations, my 10 years as an entrepreneur, I thought, oh my goodness, if I'd have applied that metric or even the idea of these type of metrics to every single large meeting I had, I think they may have looked very different and the outcome would have looked very different. So I'm super interested in, for our listeners, how would you go about setting up the return on time invested? What does it look like, and how can you measure it?
And what I love about return on time investment, I first learned this concept from my colleague Elise Keith. And what's so great about it is it's so simple. So it's a simple activity. I recommend leaders do it after about 10% of the meetings they run. Ask the attendees, the customers, the users of the meeting on a scale of 0 to 5, to what extent was this meeting worth the time you invested? Meeting measurement in general is so complicated. It's so hard because in part, we have what I call a meeting suck reflex, right? We are conditioned to believe that meetings are bad. And there's fascinating research to show if you ask people to rate their meetings publicly, they rate them much more negatively than when they do rate the same meetings privately. And that is because we're socially conditioned, right? There are a few things that bond coworkers faster than, bonding over the hour-long meeting that could have been a 3-line email. And so you can't just go into an organization and, ask employees, how effective are your meetings, for multiple reasons, but in particular because you're going to get this reflex, not the reality. And so time isn't a perfect measurement, but everyone has an intuitive sense of their value of their time. And I find this is the best gut check, at least in a pre-AI era. And we can talk about potentially how AI may change things, but at least in a pre-AI era, return on time investment, it takes a minute, maybe 2 minutes, and it gives you really valuable feedback. I recommend a second question, as does Elise. What would it take for me as the organizer to improve your score by 1 point? So you're getting some actionable feedback as well. But those two inputs can give you a lot of information, because often what you'll find is the ratings are split. You'll have, in many cases, a group that's rating it 4 or 5 and a group that's rating the meeting 0 or 1. In that case, you've designed a meeting that's worthwhile for some people, but not for others. And that gives you valuable information, right? You can probably make the meeting significantly more lean in terms of the attendees. And then you're getting some useful information as well. Certainly, I've seen cases where 95% of meeting attendees will rate the meeting 0 or 1, because what we also know is meetings suffer from what's sometimes called pluralistic ignorance, meaning we often think the meeting is bad, but we don't think others think it is bad as we do. And so we don't speak up and call out the bad meeting. And so part of this is the conversation. I recommend doing this anonymously, but part of this is sparking a conversation around, wow, does this meeting really need to exist? Perhaps it was once valuable, but perhaps it has outgrown its usefulness.
And of course, to have those conversations, Rebecca, we need psychologically safe team spaces, don't we? For people to actually address that. And we know that that isn't the case across the board, not the majority of team spaces. But if I come back to this value of impact and effort, and you say that, if it's not 3 or above an impact, then you could say that you don't need it and it's not a good use of your time. And that people will automatically go to groupthink or not necessarily say, because it's a bit like the standard answer, isn't it? So, how's work? Oh, busy, because busy means, as we said before, my identity is senior in the organization. I'm very busy. Everybody needs my time. Everybody wants my time, which
Mhm.
is where I like the idea of looking through the product lens and the value. So the value of the meeting, the value we create, what's the minimum viable sort of product for a valuable meeting, which brings me to meeting Doomsday. So I love
Mm.
that phrase where you cancel everything, you start from zero. Sounds radical, but actually it's the most rational thing maybe an organization can do. What typically happens when organizations do this? I mean, you speak about it in various examples in your book, and I love the our meeting Geddon. So those type of things, can you walk us through how organizations can go about taking a very bold and disruptive move to say meetings are a product and
Mhm.
they have to be financially viable?
Yes. And I think the key here is, yes, it's radical. Yes, it's bold. It's only 48 hours, though. And at the same time, to do it well, there is a lot of planning. And in the book, I talk about there are lots of examples throughout, certainly the last 10 years in particular, where organizations have launched these calendar cleanses and largely blindsided employees. It's been the IT team running a script, all the meetings delete from the calendar, and you start fresh that way. In my experience, that offers temporary relief, But employees really don't feel that sense of ownership. They feel a sense of relief, but they've been blindsided, right? They haven't been part of identifying the problem or, moreover, the solution. And so, what Meeting Doomsday does differently is it really puts the power and ownership in the hands of employees. So, employees do the deletion themselves. It's a coordinated effort with lots of planning, with leadership buy in, but employees are doing the deletion. So, they delete their recurring meetings for 48 hours. And then they're invited to re add meetings back to their calendar, but only add back the valuable ones. So, again, look at impact and effort as two of those dimensions. And if you are going to add a meeting back to the calendar, think about how you might redesign it across different dimensions, the length, the cadence, the attendees, and the agenda items, so that it's most valuable for the current moment of work and what you need to move work forward. And what's fascinating is we see most of the time savings actually doesn't come from canceling meetings wholesale. That's a significant chunk, but most of the time savings come from the small changes that add up. The 30-minute meetings that become 25-minute meetings or 15-minute meetings, the 6 people meetings that become 5 or 3 person. Because we meet so often, these small changes do add up. And the biggest change by and far is around the mental approach to meetings. It's not just resetting our calendars. In so many ways, it's resetting our assumptions about what actually deserves to be a meeting, and critically, giving employees that social permission to decline. We feel so much guilt associated with canceling meetings. We feel like we're canceling the person, not just the meeting. And so this gives employees an opportunity to say, hey, this is an organization sanctioned effort. This is why we're doing it. Here are scripts as well that I've been given by my organization. I no longer feel as much guilt that is motivating me to keep these meetings on the calendar when I know they're not worth the time I'm putting into them.
And I think it's also a layer down linked to status and identity, isn't it? So saying no to
Mm,
someone's meeting is, you don't want to offend them, but if they're higher than you or
yes.
a major stakeholder, you don't want to seem like you're not at the same level or that you don't think they're important and things like that. And as I read this Meeting Doomsday and as you were going through it then, I felt a reaction of, oh, that feels really scary to sort of step out of that because
Mm,
that's what we do and that's the way organizations run. But when people are overwhelmed and there is fear, they often default to more meeting, not less.
mm.
So, as a way to feel like they're managing the chaos and that they're still moving forward and that they're still important. What would your advice be there, Rebecca? Because you've seen lots of organizations do this. And I'm sure the listeners are listening with the same physical reaction as me to what you're saying, going, sounds great, but that also sounds pretty scary.
Yes, and here is where, there's a chapter in the book on systems thinking. We often like to think meetings are the problem. Usually they're a symptom of a bigger problem, and that is a broken communication system. But systems thinking, where I think it comes into play, is I see it all the time when organizations don't have a mechanism that enables workers to understand how their work contributes to the bigger picture, they overwhelmingly default to meetings. I think it's the clearest sign. And so here, this is where OKRs become really important, or some version of OKRs, having that central source of truth where you can see everyone's priorities. There's radical transparency around what am I responsible for? How does that ladder up to my company goals? And what does success look like? Because if employees don't have that clarity, well, the easiest way to show success is busyness and performative productivity. I think this is the missing gap. And we see in our research on the order of about 50% of employees can't tell you how their work contributes to company goals. We see 2/3 of workers saying sometimes it is more important for them to show they're busy than actually moving work forward. And it's a pervasive problem that certainly isn't getting better with AI, when there's even more temptation to show you're clicking the tool and show you're AI fluent, as opposed to really thinking about how can we use this technology that's inherently imperfect to move work forward. I think it's certainly in most organizations not getting better.
No. And I wanted to come to culture change because it's tough, isn't it, culture change? And we are essentially talking about the cultural habits of organizational culture as well. And I'm going to run it into the questions I also had on AI because they are intricately linked. So you run the Work AI Institute at Glean, which means for me, you're at the intersection of meeting reform and AI adoption. And there is a middle ground there with opportunities, and the two things are colliding in real time. So you've got AI note takers, async first tools, meeting summaries, digital facilitation, et cetera, et cetera. Is AI going to save, in inverted commas, our meetings, Rebecca? Or will it just give us a very well organized account of how they're being run badly? Because I'm super interested in everything that AI can bring and the opportunities and enablement, but I can see it also going towards something very transactional and it just documenting the existing status quo. So I'd be super interested in one, your research, and two, your vision for what AI is going to bring to meetings and the meeting culture in organizations.
I think in so many ways we over index on treating AI as something fundamentally new in terms of new technology. There are aspects of it that are certainly different than previous technologies. But at the core, we know that no technology is inherently good or bad. No technology is on its own going to transform our organization. It is about how we enact it and the culture we build around, what does this technology mean for our workforce? And that is why we're seeing this bifurcation in terms of we are absolutely seeing organizations harness this technology for the betterment of both the employees and the organizations. But we're also absolutely seeing organizations think that rolling out the technology is sufficient and hoping that it's going to magically transform some part of their workplace. And in the latter camp, we're seeing more instances of AI making meetings worse, making collaboration worse, making work processes worse, because in many ways it gives us a shortcut. And certainly in meetings, this is the case where it gives employees yet another way to cognitively offload the hard work that should be happening in a meeting. Still find it baffling the sheer volume of meeting note takers that are in meetings, even more so the fact that employees are starting to send digital twins to meetings instead of showing up themselves. It's a sign that we don't need the meeting. That meeting should be an email, it should be an update in the project tracker or nothing at all. This is the risk. The risk is that we over index on the technology and use it to cognitively offload the work that we should be doing. I think there's enormous potential for AI to make our meetings better. And I'm seeing loads of evidence of that, but it doesn't happen without a lot of intentionality and being very clear on what is the role, just as you would any other human attendee in the meeting. What is the role for this technology to play and how is it in service of the humans in the room?
Because you wrote, didn't you, previously about collaboration overload, where high performers are drowning in meetings, messages, requests, et cetera, et cetera. Do you think this is going to supercharge that? Or do you think it's going to help us collaborate more effectively? Or is it back to your former point of this is about intentional product in inverted commas design? So it's about how you design your collaboration.
It is. And I'm convinced of that because I'm seeing both sides of it. I'm absolutely seeing, and we have a amazing research partner at the Work AI Institute, Runa from Berkeley. She's done incredibly important research on the intensification of work that is happening with AI. For so many reasons, AI is creating conditions that intensify work, both in terms of pressures from the organization, but her research actually shows a lot of it comes from the employee because this technology often feels consumery because it gives us capabilities we haven't had before. We're tinkering later into the night, and that's a source of overwhelm. So we're absolutely seeing that. But I'm also seeing organizations think very strategically about okay, how might we use this technology to actually minimize collaboration overload? I'm actually getting ready for a talk next week where I have a whole section of the presentation on what are the different ways we can harness the technology specifically to reduce collaboration overload. And one of the most exciting areas is starting to measure that collaboration intensity and starting to become much more strategic about what patterns of collaboration are conducive for certain types of outputs. We know that if we're trying to be creative, well, that necessarily should involve a different type of collaboration fingerprint than if we're trying to coordinate work and move work forward. There needs to be much more diversity. It needs to be much more inefficient as opposed to planning and coordination, which ideally you're having a convergence of perspectives and opinions as opposed to a divergence. And so that becomes incredibly exciting. And I have leveraged AI in meetings to nudge teams in the right collaborative gear, either towards convergence or towards divergence if we're trying to optimize for creativity. So that I'm incredibly excited about. And I think it gives us a taste of the future of this technology. And if we are intentional about bringing AI into the meeting setting as a teammate, well, how might it improve the overall effectiveness?
And it brings us, for me, full circle back round to your 7 design principles, the flow and systems thinking and the
Mhm.
innovation and iteration part. When I look at your 7 design principles, which one are you finding, Rebecca, is the most counterintuitive for people? Because I think designing a product feels a lot easier, in inverted commas, and more tangible than designing a meeting, although it's exactly
Mhm.
the same process in terms of cognition.
The ones that step out of strictly the meeting context, I think tend to almost by design be a little bit more challenging or require more strategic thinking. So, in particular, the systems thinking piece, because that isn't just about the meeting context, it's about the broader communication system, rhythm as well. Rhythm, by definition, involves syncing or not syncing to some either external to the organization or internal to the organization, different motions. So, that requires a little bit more strategic thinking and bigger picture thinking. I think those two in particular. The other ones are pretty squarely focused on the meeting context.
And as I read your book and as I was looking at the design principles and thinking about Amy Edmondson's work on psychological safety, and you've said radical transparency, OKRs, rating meetings from 0 to 5, all those things need a space where people feel safe enough to actually, one, speak up, two, healthily challenge each other, and three, make bold or disruptive suggestions or ideas. And I kept thinking to myself, therefore, meeting design is one of the most powerful levers for either building or destroying that safety. First, are you in agreement with that? You may not be. And second, what would your advice be?
I am, and I'm pretty convinced that meeting design is one of the clearest ways we can demonstrate leadership within the organization. It is an anomaly in many ways to be able to run a very effective meeting and be able to steer a dysfunctional meeting back on track. And the natural association is this person, they can run a meeting. They know how to respect other people's time. As my mentor, Bob Sutton, will say, they're a steward of other people's time. Well, you start to invest a lot of trust in them that they can also manage and lead something bigger, a team, a function, a project. The reverse is also true, certainly. If you see someone who can't run a meeting, they can't steer a bad meeting back on track, well, that doesn't instill a whole bunch of confidence that they can lead anything bigger. And I think psychological safety is a part of that, right? If you can create a psychologically safe environment in a meeting, well, probably you're going to do it outside of the meeting as well. And it is a hallmark of effective leaders. And especially now, I just wrote a piece. I was listening to Amy Edmondson speak a few weeks ago and talk about psychological safety. And I think it couldn't be more important than it is now when there's so much fear around the technology. And we're seeing the most successful organizations, they're figuring out, how do I create an environment where employees are raising their hand and telling leaders when this technology is not working, when it's requiring too much effort, when it's spewing nonsense, and not being incentivized to just go through the motions to show they're being productive, as we've spoken about. So I think it's incredibly important. It's hard to do. And it absolutely requires the leader to be the tip of the arrow in creating that environment. And sometimes the best way to do that is to remove yourself as the leader from the meeting, right? Sometimes that is the best. I talk about Steve Jobs in the book and how he did that at Pixar. Always a leader has a gravitational pull where we change what we say inevitably when a leader is in the meeting. Sometimes the best action is to recognize that and step out of the meeting. But, that doesn't for sure diminish the importance of your role in creating that psychologically safe environment.
And I think if I come back to cognitive debt, there is also an intentional design there for me for leaders to keep their cognitive dynamism. So AI can be confidently right and confidently wrong. So if I come back to what do I trust as it comes out of the machine, and if I think it's wrong, how do I say it? What's your vision, Rebecca? You've worked on this a lot, and we are at a tipping point in terms of not only meetings, but also workplace and hybrid workplaces and agentic AI and humans collaborating together. What's your vision going forward for what good hybrid meetings will look like? Let's go to the end of 2028. How would you see that looking and feeling in organizations?
Gosh, it's really hard with this technology to think beyond 6 months. And my hope is that we again become much more intentional about hybrid meetings in general. There's lots of evidence that we don't think carefully about location as we design meetings. There's so much opportunity to not just schedule the meeting based on the open slot in the calendar, but think about if you do work in a hybrid environment and you do, and not all organizations do, but many do have situations where they have some days of the week or hours of the day when folks are co located versus not. Well, we can much more effectively design meetings to take advantage of that. We know absolutely certain types of work behaviors are more effective if they happen face to face. Certainly, any type of conversation that's emotionally driven, usually not always, but usually brainstorming or some rapid synchronous communication. But if we're indexing more on information exchange, now a meeting should never be purely information exchange, but if it's less complex, if it's less emotionally intense, if it's less of what I refer to in the book of a one-way door decision, well, we can probably orient more towards remote. Doing that calculus is really important. I think AI can be another tool to do that. If AI has enough context on your organization, and I'm starting to see some really creative uses of this, well, it can actually make that determination. Hey, given the complex calculus of who's in the office, logistical constraints, schedule constraints, what type of work we're doing, what the meeting is intended to achieve, we can use the technology in very exciting ways to become much more strategic in a way that we as humans, it's often too much complexity and too much time involved to make that determination. That becomes really exciting. So I think if I'm looking 6 months, a year in the future, I hope, and I think the technology is at this point already, where we can leverage AI to start to allow us to become more human about how we schedule these hybrid meetings and not just default to the open space on the calendar.
And of course, that means, well, the assumption is that we have headspace and time to dedicate to that so that we can think about that system. And I love the fact that in your book, you've got like sort of templates and checklists of how this could be done. As we come to the end of the podcast, can you advise our listeners who are sitting there thinking, yeah, one sounds familiar, two, I could do with that, three, it sounds hard, don't know where to start. But, this busy work day, I know that my day is full of back-to-back meetings and tomorrow and the day after. Maybe I've got an hour on Friday at lunch. What would your advice be, Rebecca? Because it can feel incredibly overwhelming, can't it?
It can. And especially if you're an individual contributor, and in particular, if you're in an organization where there isn't this commitment to better meeting design, it can feel overwhelming. And in many ways, it's a very, very hard uphill battle. But start small. We all have dysfunctional meetings on our calendar. Almost all of us run at least one meeting. There are lots of small changes we can make that make meaningful improvements. In the book, I talk about the rule of halves as an exercise. Pick a meeting that you know is dysfunctional, probably one that you run, but if not, you can work with the organizer of one you don't run, and pick a dimension of the meeting, the length, the cadence, the agenda items, or the attendees, and try cutting it in half. What if you were to run that 30-minute meeting as a 15-minute meeting? And often what happens is people start to question in a very positive way, why is this meeting now 15 minutes? You must have put some thought and effort into the design of the meeting. It often sparks a really healthy conversation that has a domino effect to other meetings. And if not, you might cut too deep. But as I say in the book, it's usually only in the moments where we go one step too deep do we realize what was actually essential and what was dead weight. And I think that's something we should all be doing because it's in service of certainly our organization and our team, but also in service of ourselves. We need deep work time. We need headspace right now, in particular, in such a complex environment where we're all also grappling with how do we upskill and reskill along this technology. Meetings are in so many ways a hindrance to our ability to do that in a thoughtful way.
Thank you. I'm going to leave our listeners with that and the idea of meeting Doomsday. And my biggest takeaway is that meetings themselves are useful, but we need to look at the financial and personal cost and intentionally take a step back and look at who they're for, why we need them, and what the designed outcome should be. Rebecca, thank you very much for coming and sharing your research and your stories on meetings and meeting culture. Where can people find out more about you and what you do?
Well, thank you so much for having me. This has been a fun conversation. I'm on LinkedIn. That's my go-to social platform these days. You can find our Work AI Institute research at workai.institute. We have some research that's actually publishing tomorrow, so it'll be live by the time this airs. And then my website's rebeccahinds.com.
Excellent. I'll put all those links in the show notes, and I would invite everybody to go and read this book of The Best Meeting Ever and to look at how you can actually design for better meetings. Rebecca, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me.
What I keep coming back to from this conversation is this. Every meeting needs to be necessary, and every meeting is in itself a leadership signal. It tells the people in the room what you value, whether their voice matters, and whether this organization is serious about getting things done or just performing busyness. And when the world is moving this fast, we just cannot afford to waste that signal. We need to think about AI, think about partnering with AI and what it can bring to the effectiveness of meetings, but also of what we do in business. If today's conversation has sparked something, a question about your team's collaboration, your meeting structure, your meeting culture, or how to lead through transformation without burning people out, I'd love to hear from you. Reach out to me directly. The link is in the show notes. And I will also put the links to Rebecca's work and Rebecca's book, Your Best Meeting Ever. I'd strongly recommend it. It's a playbook for wanting to design things differently for the value you want to create. Until next time, keep transforming, keep leading, and please cancel at least one bad meeting per week.